Brussels, Belgium, September 12, 2025. The ornate halls of the European Commission headquarters in Brussels echoed with the buzz of urgency and cautious optimism as EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen welcomed some of the continent's most powerful automotive leaders. The gathering, titled A Strategic Dialogue on the Future of the Automotive Industry, was more than just another high-level summit. It came at a moment when the European car sector, a bedrock of the continent's economy, finds itself buffeted by multiple storms, climate targets, foreign competition and rising trade tensions. Photographers captured Ursula von der Leyen smiling and shaking hands as participants filed into the meeting room. Beside her stood other top EU officials, including Stéphane Séjourné, Vice President of the Commission, and Wopke Hoekstra, Commissioner for Climate Action. Together, they posed for a group photo with industry leaders, a symbolic image of unity at a time when the automotive future looks anything but settled. The EU's automotive industry is facing what many describe as a crossroads moment. At stake is not only the technological direction of Europe's car makers, but also the survival of hundreds of thousands of jobs tied to the industry. As one senior official put it ahead of the talks, the future of European mobility is on the line. The central issue drawing these leaders to Brussels was the EU's landmark plan to phase out combustion engine vehicles by 2035. The regulation, celebrated by climate advocates as a bold step toward carbon neutrality, has increasingly drawn pushback from within the industry itself. Many executives argue that the timeline is too ambitious given the current pace of electric vehicle adoption, supply chain readiness, and consumer acceptance. Ursula von der Leyen did not mince words in addressing the challenge. She reminded the participants that Europe's credibility on climate goals is at stake. Still, she signalled openness to dialogue and potential adjustments. Ursula von der Leyen said, "This is not about retreating from our climate ambitions, but about ensuring that our industry has the tools, support and flexibility it needs to succeed." Her statement underscored the delicate balancing act she faces. On one hand, the Commission must uphold its flagship Green Deal, which legally binds the EU to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. On the other, it cannot afford to alienate one of Europe's most strategic and politically sensitive industries. Executives from Europe's top car makers arrived in Brussels with a clear message: the transition must be realistic. Companies like Volkswagen, BMW, Renault and Stellantis have all invested heavily in electric vehicles, but they warn of hurdles that could derail progress if Brussels does not adjust its approach. A German participant stressed the risks of moving too fast. He said, "Our factories cannot switch overnight, our suppliers cannot retool at the flick of a switch, and our workers cannot be retrained in a few months. We need a phased, pragmatic path." Others echoed the sentiment, pointing to bottlenecks in battery production, limited charging infrastructure, and the soaring costs of raw materials such as lithium and cobalt. Without solutions, they warned, Europe risks falling behind competitors who are moving aggressively in these sectors. The Commission officials listened carefully. Wopke Hoekstra acknowledged the scale of the challenge, but insisted that climate deadlines are non-negotiable. Wopke Hoekstra said, "We cannot afford to slow down the fight against climate change, but we can ensure the path is fair, coordinated, and backed by the right policies." Perhaps the most urgent concern hanging over the meeting was competition from China. In the past 5 years, Chinese electric vehicle makers have dramatically expanded their global footprint, undercutting European brands with cheaper, high-tech models. Backed by Beijing's subsidies and industrial policies, companies like BYD and NIO are now competing head-to-head with Europe's legacy car makers on their home turf. One French executive put it bluntly. He said, "If we don't act quickly, we risk becoming dependent on China for the future of our mobility, just as we were once dependent on Russia for energy." The fear is not only economic, but strategic. Cars are no longer just vehicles. They are platforms for data, software, and connectivity. European officials worry that losing ground to China could mean ceding leadership in technologies that define the next era of transportation. Ursula von der Leyen acknowledged this reality during the talks. Ursula von der Leyen said, "Competition must be fair." Europe cannot allow its industry to be hollowed out by unfair practices or hidden subsidies. As if the Chinese challenge were not enough, Europe's auto sector is also caught in the crossfire of US trade policies. American tariffs on European vehicles imposed under the banner of protecting US jobs and industries have cut into exports from German and Italian manufacturers in particular. Meanwhile, US subsidies under the Inflation Reduction Act have tilted the playing field further by luring EV investments away from Europe. An Italian participant voiced frustration. He said, "Our companies are investing billions in innovation, yet we face barriers abroad and rising costs at home. Europe must defend its interests." For Brussels, this means rethinking trade strategy while also considering stronger incentives for domestic EV production and critical raw material sourcing. The Commission has already proposed a Net Zero Industry Act aimed at boosting clean tech manufacturing inside the EU. But industry leaders argue that speed and scale are essential if Europe is to keep up with its rivals. Behind the technical and trade debates lies a human dimension. Millions of Europeans work directly or indirectly in the auto industry. From assembly line workers in Germany to parts suppliers in Eastern Europe, the sector remains one of the continent's largest employers. Transitioning to electric vehicles, however, could disrupt this ecosystem in profound ways. Union leaders warn that the shift to EVs, which require fewer parts and less labour, could wipe out jobs unless governments step in with retraining and social protections. One union representative present at the Brussels talks issued a stark warning. He said, "Without a just transition, we risk not only losing jobs, but losing the trust of our workers and communities." The Commission sought to reassure participants that social fairness would remain central. Stéphane Séjourné emphasised this point. Stéphane Séjourné said, "Decarbonisation will succeed only if it is accompanied by solidarity, investment in skills, and protection for those most affected." The choice of Brussels as the venue was not accidental. For decades, the city has been the nerve centre where Europe's grand visions meet the realities of compromise. This gathering of policymakers and car industry leaders reflected exactly that, a moment when Europe must reconcile ambition with feasibility, idealism with pragmatism. The optics of the meeting were carefully curated. Cameras captured mid-shots of Ursula von der Leyen leaning across the table, speaking earnestly with industry executives. Pan shots lingered on participants listening intently. The symbolism was clear. This was not a confrontation, but a dialogue. As the discussions drew to a close, no dramatic announcements were made, yet the very fact of dialogue signalled progress. For Ursula von der Leyen, the meeting was a chance to demonstrate that the EU is listening to industry concerns while holding firm to its climate agenda. The outcome now depends on what happens in the months ahead. Will Brussels soften the 2035 deadline or find ways to ease the burden on industry? Can Europe mount a credible response to China's EV dominance? And will workers and communities feel included in the transition? As one senior diplomat observing the meeting reflected, the answers will define not just the future of cars in Europe, but the credibility of the EU itself. The day in Brussels ended with polite applause, handshakes, and promises of further consultation. But beneath the formalities lies a battle over Europe's industrial identity. On one side stands the imperative of climate action. On the other lies the survival of a sector that embodies European engineering, innovation and pride. The stakes are high and the road ahead is uncertain. Yet as Ursula von der Leyen reminded her audience, the journey is unavoidable. Ursula von der Leyen said, "Europe will lead the way toward clean mobility, not by abandoning our industry, but by transforming it together."